Dennis Hancock, UGA Extension Specialist for forage crops, the Grassman. Today we're going to talk about something that's not grass. We're actually going to talk about some trees. We've had a lot of downed trees because of the windstorms with the hurricane that's blown through, and we got a lot of leaves around and a lot of limbs everywhere. And it's now that we oftentimes have problems with black cherry. Wild black cherry, or just simply wild cherry, is often an issue that we deal with. And this is a major problem for us in pastures because this tree typically will go right along the edges of the forest. It kind of likes to be on the edge of the forest. Sometimes it'll be found in full shade, but sometimes it'll be out in full sun as well. But it's a very common occurrence for us in the edges of pastures as well. And what makes this such a danger is that these leaves, once they have fallen and they start to wilt, there's a compound inside of here that actually can release cyanide, prussic acid. And this compound, if you take some of these leaves and you mix them up a little bit, you kind of crush them in your hand and you smell them, you smell a sweet smell of almond, that bitter sweet smell of almond. And that almond is actually, the smell that you're smelling is actually called amygdalin. Amygdalin is actually the Greek, or variation of the Greek word for almond. And that's because almonds are actually in the same family as the Prunus genus here, as the black cherry. In this case, we're talking about Prunus serotonin, or serotina, something like that. Prunus serotina. And this one is a major problem for us, again, because it is so commonly found along the edges of the pastures, and we get leaves and limbs that oftentimes will fall down into those pastures. But the release of that cyanide can cause poisoning. That poisoning can be very, very severe and can end up causing animal deaths within just a matter of 15 minutes to 30 minutes, somewhere in that neighborhood, after the animal has consumed a lethal dose. So the problem with it is really being able to identify this and making sure that we get rid of it if it's out there into these pastures. So I'm going to talk about some of the identifying characteristics here. First of all, the leaves, kind of very distinctive. In addition to that almond smell that I was telling you about, the leaves typically are about 2 inches wide and anywhere from 3 to 5 inches long. They have a bit of a serrated edge to them. They look like a serrated knife on the edge of the leaf. They're simple leaves and they're alternate. So you can see there's a leaf here, and then not directly across from it, but just kind of at an angle to it, there's another leaf. So that's what we call alternating simple leaves. Now there's also some distinguishing characteristics about the bark as well. The bark commonly will have some very distinctive colorations. In the new material, it's going to be kind of gray, and in the older bark, it's going to be really black. Sometimes we don't see this with the leaves on in the summer or spring, summer, or fall with the leaves actually on, so we need to identify it by its bark. And there are a couple different challenges of that, because some of the newer bark, newer parts of the plant actually will be light gray, as you can see here. But then as we get down to kind of the older part, we'll start seeing more and more of this kind of black, chunky types of arrangements there. And actually, eventually, the whole trunk will actually be covered up with that black, looks like burnt cornflakes. That's a typical description. It looks like black cornflakes or burnt cornflakes. But what's really interesting here is on the newer material, you can see these little spots. These spots are actually lenticels. And lenticels are actually where it exchanges oxygen with the environment. So you can kind of see some of that in some of the newer growth here that we have. So here we can see the leaves, and you can see the alternating simple leaf arrangement that we have here, and you can also see the serrated edge that we have along the margins of the leaves. Right along the edges, they look like a serrated knife. This is a very typical arrangement here for the black cherry. So a couple other interesting facts about black cherries is that one, they're typically relatively small, but we can have much bigger ones as well. For example, the biggest one I think that's known is up in the Smoky Mountains, up in Tennessee, and I think it's something like 180 feet tall and 70 feet wide. They can get really, really big, but normally what we see is something relatively small. Now this one is very small, but typically they would be about 20 to 40 feet tall and maybe about 15 to 20 feet wide, typically. So a couple other things about this. It's not limited just to black cherries, but we can see this in things like cherry laurel, which we oftentimes will see in the mountains. And there's also one called common choke cherry. These are all in the same Prunus genus, and they can definitely be an issue for us. Now here's typically what we would see is this would be a problem with ruminants. We don't normally have this a problem with horses. Horses normally don't like to browse on leaves or anything else for that matter other than grass and a little bit of clover. So typically we're going to see this more so on ruminants that are picking it up out of curiosity. Small ruminants, very common, sheep and goats, but also large ruminants as well. What you typically see with poisoning from the black cherry or the cyanide poisoning is that the animals actually begin to stagger around and convulse, and they get down, they have really labored breathing, and eventually they succumb to the poison. And what's happening here is it's actually interfering with oxygen exchange in the tissue of the animal. So in this particular case, the blood of that animal and the mucous membranes will actually be dark cherry red. Okay, it'll be a really bright, dark, bright cherry red color, and that's the way I think about it. That's the way I remember it, is a cherry red color is the symptomology that goes along with wild cherry poisoning. Okay, so that's a typical scenario. The problem is that it happens so fast, within 15 or 30 minutes, so it's really difficult to actually get it before the animals succumb to the poison. If the vet happens to be there, there are some treatments that they can do to put it in place and to counteract the poison, but the reality is that it's a relatively quick death. What we can do is normally see from the environment where they've fallen. Normally it's around an area where some limbs have fallen, or edges of the field, edges of the pasture, which we think probably would be where most of these black cherries are going to be. And those animals will have basically fallen in their tracks, and they might have some convulsions, some soil disturbance right around where their legs were at because of the convulsions and that sort of thing associated with their death. So it's something that we can oftentimes find out after the fact what's happened, but it's sometimes very difficult to see what's happened and to control it at the time that's actually going on. So hope that helps you out. I'll provide some liner notes here, some links to our poisonous plants series where you can learn more about all the different types of the most common, at least, poisonous plants. And of course, I'd also like to point out that you can get this in the Southern Forages textbook, brand new edition of the Southern Forages textbook, written by some of my colleagues who are, all three of them actually now retired, Dr. Don Ball from Auburn University, Carl Hovland from University of Georgia, and Dr. Gary Lacefield from University of Kentucky. And on page 222 you can read more about wild cherry as well as many other things in the Southern Forages textbook. If you have other questions, feel free to contact us and follow us there on the website, georgiaforages.com. We'll see you down the road.